September 1964, Oakland, California. There were not supposed to be witnesses. The training hall had been cleared under a different pretense. Routine instruction, closed session, nothing worth remembering. Yet by the time the doors were locked, more men had stayed than expected. Some stood along the back wall. Others pretended to adjust equipment. One of them, later identified only as Harris, would say he felt something shift before anything began. Bruce Lee never spoke publicly about what happened in that room, but several who were there agreed on one detail. It ended faster than anyone believed possible. Not cleanly, not without consequence. 9 seconds was the number that circulated afterward, not as a boast, but as a warning, because what those seconds contained was not control. And what followed was the part Bruce tried to bury. In 1964, Oakland was not yet a stage for martial arts notoriety. It was a proving ground. Bruce Lee had only recently relocated from Seattle, brought in by James Yim Lee, a respected figure among West Coast martial artists with a reputation for practicality over tradition. Together, they operated a modest training space on Broadway. It was not decorative. The floors were worn. The air held the constant scent of liniment and dust. This was not where reputations were displayed. It was where they were tested, often quietly. At that time, Bruce was still an outsider. He had demonstrated in Long Beach earlier that year, attracting attention with speed and precision that didn't align with the rigid forms most instructors were used to. His 1-inch punch demonstration circulated among martial circles, but also drew skepticism. Some dismissed it as controlled exhibition. Others called it disrespectful, too direct, too dismissive of tradition. More privately, there were concerns about what he was teaching and who he was teaching. Bruce did not restrict students based on lineage or ethnicity. In certain circles, this was not just controversial. It was seen as a violation. Word spread that he was openly challenging established boundaries, both culturally and technically. He wasn't just teaching differently. He was ignoring rules that others believed were essential to preserving the art itself. James Lee understood the risk of that approach. He had seen enough men come through the gym to know that challenges rarely announced themselves formally. They emerged through tension, through quiet visits, through individuals who wanted to verify, sometimes correct, what they believed was being done wrong. According to Harris, who at the time was a young recruit assisting with equipment maintenance, the atmosphere in the weeks leading up to the incident had changed. People started coming by who didn't belong there, he recalled years later. They wouldn't train. They would just watch. Not like students. More like measuring something. Bruce noticed it too. He became more selective about who attended certain sessions. Doors were closed earlier. Conversations with James Lee grew more private, often held in low tones near the back office. There was no panic, but there was awareness. The kind that doesn't come from fear, but from experience. Because Bruce had seen this pattern before in Hong Kong. Their disputes between martial artists didn't always stay verbal. Challenges could escalate quickly, especially when pride or reputation was involved. And here in Oakland, he was building something that directly challenged both. What made the situation volatile was not just Bruce's skill. It was his refusal to operate within accepted limits. He trained for efficiency, not demonstration. He spoke openly about discarding what didn't work. That alone created friction. But more concerning to some was his willingness to prove it physically. Not in tournaments, not in public, but in closed environments where outcomes couldn't be softened or reinterpreted. Harris described one evening in particular, roughly a week before the incident. A man came in late, didn't introduce himself, didn't bow. He just stood there, watching Bruce work with one of the students. And the way Bruce looked back at him, it wasn't anger. It was recognition. No confrontation happened that night. But after the man left, Bruce reportedly ended the session early. James Lee locked the doors himself. That was unusual. From that point forward, attendance became inconsistent. Some students were told not to return for a few days. Others were asked to come at different times. The schedule lost its pattern, replaced by something more controlled, more deliberate. The training hall wasn't closing. It was preparing. What made this particular challenge different, and why it mattered, was not just the potential for violence. It was the risk of exposure. If Bruce failed, It would confirm every criticism being whispered about him, that his methods were incomplete, that his rejection of tradition left him vulnerable, that what he taught could not withstand real pressure. But if he succeeded, especially under uncontrolled conditions, it would validate something more dangerous. That structure itself might be unnecessary. And for many watching from a distance, that was not a conclusion they were willing to accept without resistance. By late September, the tension had condensed into something tangible. No announcement was made. No official challenge was issued. But everyone close to the situation understood that something was coming. And Bruce did not attempt to avoid it. He adjusted for it. He trained differently in those final days, not longer but sharper. Short bursts, minimal movement, focus on distance, timing, interception. There was less demonstration, more silence between actions. Harris remembered asking one of the senior students what was happening. The response was brief. Someone's coming to test him. What no one in that room fully understood yet was how far that test would go, or what it would force Bruce to confront in himself. The man was not announced. There were no letters, no formal introductions, no public challenge issued through schools or associations. He arrived the way these things often did in that era, through presence alone. Quiet, uninvited, intent already formed. Years later, accounts would refer to him by different names. Some called him Wong. Others avoided naming him entirely. Harris, who stood less than 10 feet from the exchange, insisted he never heard a clear introduction. He didn't come to talk, Harris said. You could tell that immediately. He came already decided. What made the challenger credible was not his reputation in public circles, but the absence of performance in his behavior. He didn't display. He didn't posture. His movements were economical, almost restrained. The kind of control that suggested experience, not in demonstrations, but in situations where mistakes had consequences. Physically, he was compact but heavily structured through the shoulders and forearms. His stance, when he finally settled into it, was not exaggerated. No deep horse stance, no dramatic positioning, just balanced weight, slightly forward, ready to move in any direction without adjustment. James Lee noticed it first. He's not here to prove his style, he reportedly said under his breath. He's here to end something. The implication was clear. This wasn't about testing techniques. It was about stopping Bruce from continuing what he had started, teaching outside accepted boundaries, disregarding lineage, reshaping how combat was understood. For some, that wasn't innovation. It was erosion. According to one secondary witness, a man named R. Delgado, who had trained intermittently at the Oakland school, the challenger had connections to a more traditional network operating between San Francisco and Chinatown. Word was he wasn't the best, Delgado said, but he was the one they trusted to handle it. That distinction mattered. He didn't need to be the most skilled. He needed to be disciplined, reliable under pressure, and willing to carry out the intent without hesitation. Not reckless, not emotional, controlled. That made him dangerous in a different way. Because while Bruce's approach emphasized speed and adaptability, this man appeared grounded in endurance and structural strength. His base was stable, his guard tight. He wasn't searching for openings. He was waiting for them to appear through pressure. Before anything physical began, there was a brief exchange. Witnesses disagree on the exact wording, but several remember the tone. It was not aggressive in volume, but it carried finality. A question was posed, not about skill, about permission, whether Bruce intended to continue teaching outsiders. Bruce's response was short. Yes. No elaboración. No justificación. That answer removed any remaining ambiguity. Harris recalled a shift in the room at that moment. Not from the two men, but from everyone else. It stopped feeling like a demonstration, he said. It felt like something that wasn't supposed to be watched anymore. The challenger removed his outer layer slowly, folded it, placed it aside. There was no rush in his movements, but no hesitation either. His breathing remained even, shoulders loose, eyes fixed but not narrowed. Bruce, in contrast, showed subtle signs of tension. Not fear, but awareness of consequence. He understood the position he had put himself in. This was no longer about proving efficiency or refining technique. The stakes had shifted into something less defined, more personal. Because if he stepped back now, it would not be seen as restraint. It would be seen as concession. And if he stepped forward, fully committed, he risked crossing a line he had spent years trying to understand. James Lee moved the remaining observers further back. Not far enough to leave the room, but enough to create a clear space between the two men, approximately 12 feet across. No markers, no boundaries, just distance. No rules were spoken. That in itself was the condition. Delgado described the silence just before the first movement. No one gave a signal, he said. There was no start. It just began. What set this encounter apart from others Bruce had faced was not the presence of a skilled opponent. It was the intention behind him. This man was not there to exchange techniques. He was there to impose an outcome, and he was prepared to absorb damage to do it. As both men adjusted their footing, subtly, almost imperceptibly, the balance of the room shifted into something unstable. Not chaotic, but irreversible, because once the first movement was made, there would be no space left for interpretation. Only action. The room was sealed before anyone acknowledged it. James Lee didn't make an announcement. He simply walked to the front entrance, checked the latch, and slid the bolt into place. The sound was quiet, but in the stillness of the training hall, it carried. A few of the men along the wall exchanged brief looks, uncertain whether they were now witnesses or participants in something they wouldn't be able to explain later. There were no officials present. No referee, no team equipe, no agreed-upon signals to stop. That absence was not accidental. It meant that whatever happened inside that space would not be interrupted by structure. The responsibility to control escalation, if control remained possible, rested entirely on the two men facing each other. Harris would later sketch the layout from memory. The open floor measured roughly 20 feet across, though only about half of that space was truly usable. Training equipment had been pushed aside, but not removed completely. A wooden dummy stood near the far wall. A bench with hand wraps and liniment jars sat to the left. There was just enough room for movement, but not enough to disengage indefinitely. Distance mattered here. 12 feet separated them when they first settled. Too close to ignore. Too far for immediate contact. The lighting was uneven. Overhead fixtures cast a dull glow, leaving the corners of the room slightly dim. It wasn't dark, but it wasn't clean visibility either. Shadows formed around the edges of movement, making precise tracking harder once speed increased. Temperature played a role as well. The room was warm, not excessively, but enough that sweat would form quickly under exertion. The kind of heat that reduced grip over time. That made footing less reliable. Small factors, but in a confined space with no breaks, they accumulated. James Lee positioned himself off to the side, not between them, but within reach if intervention became necessary. His posture suggested readiness, but not authority. He understood that stepping in too early would carry its own consequences. Delgado stood near the back wall, arms crossed, though he admitted later his hands were clenched. No one knew where to look, he said. You wanted to watch everything at once. Their hands, their feet, their eyes. But you couldn't. You had to pick something and risk missing the rest. The emotional atmosphere did not spike in a panic. It compressed. There was a noticeable tightening among the observers, not outwardly, but internally. Breathing slowed. Movement stilled. Even those unfamiliar with combat understood that this was not a demonstration of skill. It was a test of outcome. Bruce adjusted first. Not dramatically. A slight shift of weight onto the balls of his feet. His lead hand extended. Not fully, but enough to establish distance. Fingers relaxed, not clenched. His rear hand hovered closer to his center line, ready to intercept or strike without telegraphing. His eyes did not lock rigidly onto the challenger's face. They moved, tracking shoulders, hips, the small preparatory signals that precede motion. The challenger remained more contained. His guard was tighter, hands positioned closer to his torso, elbows in, chin slightly lowered. His stance favored stability over reach. He did not mirror Bruce's extended lead. Instead, he held position, forcing Bruce to operate within his range if engagement occurred. This created an imbalance in initiative. Bruce would need to bridge the distance. The challenger would not. Harris remembered noticing Bruce's breathing. It wasn't heavy, he said, but it wasn't calm either. It was measured, like he was deciding something with each breath. That detail stayed with him, because it suggested that Bruce was not only preparing physically, he was regulating something internal. Not fear in the conventional sense, but restraint. Control over how far he was willing to go once movement began. No verbal signal marked the start, but there was a moment, a shift so subtle it almost passed unnoticed when both men stopped adjusting. No more micro-corrections. No more repositioning. They had settled. That stillness lasted less than a second. Then it broke. And when it did, the room changed from observation to consequence. It began without declaration. Harris would later insist there was no visible cue, no flinch, no shift dramatic enough to mark a clear start. One moment, both men were still, suspended in that narrow band between readiness and action. Then the distance collapsed. Bruce moved first, not with a step, but with a forward drive off his rear leg, his lead hand firing out in a straight line toward the challenger's face. It wasn't a committed strike meant to finish. It was a probe, fast enough to demand reaction, precise enough to measure timing. The challenger didn't retreat. He absorbed the distance instead, tightening his guard as the strike came in. His right forearm rose just enough to deflect, not block, the incoming hand, redirecting it slightly off center line. At the same moment, his weight shifted forward. He answered immediately. A short, compact punch drove toward Bruce's midsection, not wide, not telegraphed. It traveled only a few inches before impact, powered more by structure than swing. The kind of strike meant to disrupt balance rather than display force. It landed, not cleanly, but enough. Bruce's torso recoiled slightly as the contact compressed into his lower ribs. There was a dull sound, not sharp, not dramatic, the kind that doesn't register fully until seconds later. Harris remembered that moment clearly. That's when I realized he could be hit, he said. Up until then, I don't think anyone in that room had actually seen it. Bruce didn't step back. Instead, he adjusted inside the space that had just been created. His rear hand snapped forward in a vertical punch aimed at the challenger's face, traveling along the shortest path. At the same time, his lead foot slid in, not a full step, but enough to close the remaining gap. The punch connected, not flush, but it snapped the challenger's head slightly off alignment. The response was immediate. A tightening through the neck, a recentering of posture. No visible hesitation. No break in composure. Now they were too close for measured distance. The exchange compressed into short-range engagement, where reaction time shortened and structural integrity became more important than speed alone. The challenger attempted to clinch. His left hand moved to control Bruce's lead arm while his right shoulder drove forward, aiming to collapse Bruce's posture and limit striking angles. It was efficient, practiced, not a desperate grab, but a transition into a range where his base gave him advantage. Bruce resisted the contact. His elbow dropped sharply, cutting the line of control, while his body angled slightly off-center. Instead of pulling away, he moved along the edge of the pressure, redirecting it just enough to avoid being locked in place. Another strike followed. Short, direct, this time aimed lower, toward the solar plexus. It landed cleaner. The challenger's breath shifted, barely audible, but visible in the tightening of his abdomen. Still, he did not disengage. His hands adjusted, searching again for control points, attempting to slow the pace, to turn the exchange into something more methodical. That was the divergence. Bruce accelerated. His movements became less about single strikes and more about continuous interruption. Hands firing in sequence, each one forcing a reaction before the previous had fully resolved. Not wide combinations, not exaggerated motion, just direct, linear pressure applied faster than the challenger could reset. But it wasn't seamless. One of the challenger's counters broke through, a short hook, compact and driven from the torso. It clipped the side of Bruce's jaw, not enough to stagger, but enough to turn his head, to disrupt alignment for a fraction of a second. That fraction mattered. For the first time, Bruce's rhythm broke. Harris described it as a hitch, a moment where movement didn't flow cleanly from one action to the next. It was small. Most wouldn't have noticed. But in that space, it created opportunity. The challenger pressed into it. His weight came forward again, attempting to capitalize on the disruption, to force Bruce backward, to reclaim initiative through pressure rather than speed. But Bruce didn't give ground. He reset faster than expected. His footing stabilized. His head came back to center. And his next movement was sharper, not faster, but more decisive. A straight lead shot through the narrowing space, landing with clearer alignment than any strike before it. The challenger's head snapped back slightly, not exaggerated, but enough to break his forward drive. Silence held for a fraction longer than the movement itself. Because something had changed. Up to that point, both men had been measuring. Now they were adjusting, and the space between control and damage was getting thinner. The shift was not in speed. It was in intent. Up to that point, both men had been operating within a narrow margin, testing structure, forcing reactions, searching for control without fully committing to irreversible damage. But after the last clean strike landed, that margin began to collapse. The challenger stepped in again. This time, there was less patience in the movement. His guard tightened further as he drove forward, attempting to close distance completely and eliminate Bruce's ability to strike in sequence. His left hand shot out, not as a strike, but as a clamp, aiming to seize Bruce's lead arm and anchor it. His right shoulder followed immediately behind, turning his body into a compact wedge designed to break posture. He made contact. His grip caught fabric and forearm together, pulling inward. At the same time, his weight shifted aggressively forward, forcing Bruce back a half step, just enough to disrupt footing. It was the first time Bruce lost ground. Not dramatically, not a stumble, but it registered. Harris saw Bruce's heel slide slightly against the floor. That's when it stopped looking controlled, he said. Not out of control, but like control was getting harder to keep. The challenger pressed the advantage. A short knee lifted toward Bruce's midsection, not high, not wide. Direct, meant to compress air, to reduce movement, to make the next action slower. It connected partially. Bruce's torso folded just enough to absorb it, his breath forced out in a sharp, contained exhale. His arms are no longer free. One was partially trapped, the other constrained by proximity. For a moment, the exchange stalled, not in stillness, but in compression. Both men locked within a range where movement required force to create space. This was the edge, and Bruce knew it, because in that position, speed no longer protected him. Only decision did. He had two options: continue controlling, risk prolonged entanglement, absorb more damage, allow the challenger to impose structure, or end it quickly, decisively, with consequences that could not be reversed. Harris would later describe Bruce's expression in that moment. It changed, he said. Not anger, not panic, just something shutting off. Bruce stopped resisting the grip. For a fraction of a second, he yielded. His body relaxed. Not outwardly, but structurally. The tension that had been pushing against the challenger's hold disappeared just enough to create a false sense of compliance. The challenger adjusted instinctively, tightening his control, shifting his balance to account for the change. That was the opening. Bruce's trapped arm rotated, not by pulling free, but by collapsing inward along its own line. His elbow dropped sharply, cutting the angle of the grip. At the same time, his hips shifted, not backward but slightly offline, creating a narrow channel between their bodies. His free hand moved, not wide, not telegraphed. A direct strike, short, vertical, traveling only inches, drove upward under the challenger's guard, targeting the base of the jaw. It landed clean. The sound was different this time. Not dull, not absorbed, sharp. The challenger's head snapped back more visibly, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. Not fully released, but compromised. Bruce didn't pause. He followed immediately. Another strike, same line, slightly lower, drove into the throat region. Not a full-force blow, but enough to disrupt breath, to force reflexive withdrawal. Now space opened. Not much. Just enough. Bruce stepped in, not back, closing the gap before the challenger could recover structure. His shoulder drove forward, turning his body into the pressure point this time. The dynamic reversed. The challenger attempted to reset, but his timing was off. His base shifted late. Bruce's final movement came without visible preparation. A straight lead, precise, aligned, drove forward into the center line, connecting with the face at a distance so short it barely resembled a strike. There was no swing, only transfer. The challenger's body reacted immediately. His posture broke, not dramatically, but definitively. His weight shifted backward, his footing disrupted just enough that he had to step to recover. He didn't fall, but he disengaged, and that was the end. Not because he couldn't continue, but because the outcome had become clear. James Lee stepped in then, not forcefully, but with presence, enough to separate the space, to mark the boundary that had not existed seconds before. No one spoke. The room held its breath, not in anticipation, but in recognition. Harris looked at Bruce first. He wasn't celebrating, he said. He wasn't even looking at the other guy. He was just standing there, like he was checking something inside himself, because the decision had been made, not in the final strike, but in the moment before it. How far to go? How much to allow? And how much to stop? Bruce had ended it quickly, but not without crossing close enough to understand exactly what would have happened if he hadn't stopped when he did. No one marked the time officially, but the number, 9 seconds, circulated anyway. Not immediately, not in the room itself. There, the silence lingered longer than the exchange had. Men who had stayed out of curiosity now avoided each other's eyes. The absence of commentary was not restraint. It was uncertainty. No one seemed fully prepared to describe what they had just witnessed without committing to an interpretation they weren't confident in. The challenger recovered his posture first. He did not collapse. He did not argue. He adjusted his stance, inhaled once, slow, controlled despite the disruption, and stepped back. There was a visible tightening around his jaw, a faint redness forming along the line where the final strike had landed. His breathing was no longer even, but it was functional. He looked at Bruce briefly, not with hostility, not with submission, assessment. Then he turned, retrieved his outer layer, and left without further exchange. That, more than anything, stayed with Harris. I thought there'd be something after, he said. An argument, a statement, something to explain it. But there was nothing. Just over. James Lee unbolted the door a few seconds later. The sound of the latch sliding free broke whatever remained of the moment. A few men stepped out immediately, as if distance might help them process what they had seen. Others lingered, but no one resumed training. Bruce did not address the room. He moved to the side, picked up a cloth, and wiped his hands slowly. There were no visible injuries beyond minor redness along his jaw where the hook had clipped him. But his breathing was still elevated, not from exertion alone, from containment. Delgado approached him cautiously, as if unsure whether interaction was appropriate. He just asked if he was all right, Delgado recalled. And Bruce said, I'm fine. But it didn't sound like he meant physically. That distinction became clearer in the days that followed. Training resumed, but not immediately and not in the same form. Sessions became shorter, more focused, less demonstration, more direct application. Bruce adjusted how he moved, not visibly to an untrained eye, but enough that those who had been present noticed the change. He eliminated certain pauses, reduced transitional movements, closed gaps that previously existed between actions. It wasn't a shift toward aggression. It was a shift toward efficiency under pressure. Harris described it as less room for things to go wrong. But alongside that refinement came something else, a restraint that was more deliberate. Bruce had always emphasized control, but now it carried a different weight. Not theoretical, not instructional, experienced, because in that room, he had felt the edge of losing control, not to his opponent, but to the situation itself. The moment where speed alone wasn't enough, where structure threatened to override adaptability, where the decision to escalate had to be made without certainty of consequence. And he had crossed close to that line, close enough to understand what lay beyond it. The incident was never formalized. No record filed. No public acknowledgement. Among those present, it became something referenced indirectly. That night, the test, the Oakland fight. Details shifted depending on who spoke, but certain elements remained consistent. The speed, the compression of space, the absence of rules, and the final decision to stop. Outside that circle, it dissolved into rumor. Some exaggerated it. Others dismissed it entirely. Bruce did neither. He simply didn't speak about it. But his approach evolved. In later years, when he spoke about combat, not as performance, but as reality, there was an undercurrent that hadn't been there before. Less emphasis on demonstration. More on ending conflict quickly. Not out of dominance, but out of necessity. Because prolonging it introduced variables. And variables created risk. Harris would revisit the memory decades later. When asked what separated that moment from anything else he had seen, he didn't mention speed. Or technique. He focused on the pause, brief, almost invisible, before the final sequence. The part people don't understand, he said, is that it could have gone further. You could see it. He knew exactly where to go next. And he chose not to. There was no applause in that room. No acknowledgement. Just a shared understanding that something had been tested and narrowly contained. And that the most important part of what happened was not how fast it ended, but how close it came to not stopping at all.